The man known to history as Bram Stoker was born on the 8th of November 1847 at Merino Crescent, an affluent collection of Georgian townhouses in the town of Clontarf, a coastal suburb of the city of Dublin. His full baptismal name was Abraham Stoker. Bram is simply an abbreviation of Abraham, though it is the name by which he is most well known to posterity. His father was also Abraham Stoker, after whom he was named. Abraham Sr. worked as a clerk for the British administration in Ireland, operating out of Dublin Castle in the heart of the capital city. Stoker's mother was Charlotte Stoker, née Thornley, a woman originally from Sligo in the far west of the country. Both she and her husband were members of the Church of Ireland, the Protestant state-led church, and both the Stoker and Thornley families were members of the English colonial ascendancy in Ireland. She and Abraham had 7 children in all, of which Bram was the third. He had an older brother and sister, William and Matilda, and 4 younger siblings, Thomas, Richard, Margaret, and George. Stoker was born into a reasonably affluent family, though the Stokers were not rich by any stretch of the imagination, and the education of their 7 children would leave Abraham Sr. and Charlotte in debt. Nevertheless, their lot was better than most people in the country around them. Ireland was extremely poor in the 19th century. Centuries of British rule had created gross social inequalities whereby the majority of Irish people, whose adherence to Roman Catholicism was deemed to be politically and socially problematic, had been dispossessed through mass land confiscations and plantations in the 16th and 17th centuries. This had led to the creation of a British landlord class that dominated the country despite constituting only around 20% of the population. Most Irish people lived on tiny plots of rented land where they eked out a subsistence living from the potato crop. Even as Stoker was born in 1847, the potato famine was hitting all of Europe. The fungus that causes immense damage to the crop had only recently arrived to the Old World from the Americas on the first steamships. The resulting famine that it wrought in Ireland would kill over 1 million Irish people by the mid-1850s and would trigger the mass migration of millions of more Irish people by the end of the 19th century. Political tensions always ran high in Ireland owing to its poverty and political disenfranchisement, with a Home Rule movement calling for a restored Irish Parliament and the devolution of power to Dublin, dominating Irish politics during Stoker's life. Yet there were green shoots. Burgeoning industrialisation and political reform were creating a vibrant literary revival in Dublin and amongst the London Irish. All of these Irish political and social factors would influence Stoker's life and writing to one degree or another. Stoker's education and those of his siblings was a great priority for his parents. While Abraham Sr. was a busy man who spent much of his time undertaking the trip from Clontarf to the centre of the capital to work at Dublin Castle, the children's mother took their education in hand. Charlotte Stoker was a learned woman and a charitable worker. one who began working to reform and raise awareness about the harsh workhouse system that had proliferated across the country during the famine years. She subsequently published several books and pamphlets on topics such as the provision of aid to those who were deaf, the position of women within the Irish workhouses, and the ravages of the cholera epidemic in Ireland. She passed on her belief in education and social reform to her children. Bram, in particular, inherited her literary streak. The children would flourish as a result. Both William and George went on to become esteemed physicians and surgeons, George inventing a type of inhaler, and William as president of the Royal Academy of Medicine in Ireland. Early on, Bram's future fortunes were unclear. He was a sickly child, one who was bedridden for much of his earliest years. However, he eventually made a full recovery and even became an athlete in his teenage years while being educated at Bective House, a private school. He otherwise later viewed his childhood illness as formative in his development. It afforded him the time to read a lot in his earliest years and for his imagination to flourish. In 1864, Stoker headed to attend Trinity College, Dublin. By then, Trinity had competition within the Irish higher education system, as numerous additional Irish universities had been founded in Dublin, Cork, and Galway in the 1840s and 1850s, but it was still unquestionably the elite Irish university. He would study there for the next 6 years, eventually receiving his Bachelor of Arts in 1870. Stoker did well at Trinity, both in terms of his academic work and his wider engagement with college life. He was, for instance, the auditor of the College Historical Society and the president of the University Philosophical Society, the only figure to have held both those positions at Trinity. The Philosophical Society claims to be the oldest newspaper-producing student philosophical society in the world. In terms of his teachers, a guiding influence was Professor Edward Dowden, a literary critic and writer. Dowden was a young man at the time. He had been appointed to the chair of English literature at Trinity at 24 years of age in 1867. Stoker quickly became an admirer. Though Dowden's early work was on William Shakespeare, his primary influence over Stoker was in introducing him to a wide range of more modern American writers, notably Walt Whitman, whose poetry collection, Leaves of Grass, had been published in 1855, though, in terms of his own writing in years to come, Stoker was far more influenced by American authors like Edgar Allan Poe. Stoker's years at Trinity overlapped with those of many key figures of the Irish literary revival. This was a period in the late 19th and early 20th centuries during which Irish culture, particularly its written culture, experienced a renaissance after a grim period in Ireland socially and culturally in the first half of the 19th century. From an international perspective, it was notable for producing such luminaries as the poet W.B. Yeats and the playwright, poet and author Oscar Wilde, while James Joyce could also be viewed as a byproduct of it on the continent. At home in Ireland, there were dozens of other writers and scholars associated with it who made major contributions to Irish scholarship from the 1870s onwards. Some of these were contemporaries of Stoker at Trinity in the 1860s. Standish O'Grady was eminent amongst these, later becoming a noted Irish historian and journalist, one who conceptualized ancient Ireland as having a culture as vital as that of Homeric Greece. Alfred Percival Graves and John Todhunter were two others. Graves was a poet and a substantial one, albeit he is overshadowed today by the success of his son Robert in the same field. Todhunter also became a notable poet. The sense we get is of a vibrant environment at Trinity in the mid-1860s which would have encouraged Stoker in his burgeoning desire to become a writer himself.
This video is brought to you by Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, the exciting turn-based tactical strategy game set in the eternal conflict of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. In Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, you bring some of the universe's most powerful warriors to lightning-fast tactical skirmishes, where you are in full control and only superior tactics can deliver victory. Expand your collection across multiple factions to find new tactical possibilities as you bring your troops to battle and sweep the galaxy clear of all resistance. New players and long-standing fans of the Warhammer universe alike will find a challenge in Tacticus as they progress and compete in various game modes, including PvE campaigns, PvP, live events, guild raids and much more. Only with Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus can you lead 70+ legendary Warhammer 40,000 champions from 17 playable factions, fight against or strategize with other players in high-stake battles, and join a passionate community of gamers and Warhammer fans alike. Since the game release back in August 2022, Snowprint Studios has continually introduced fresh content, exciting features, new game modes and challenging events. This December, the famous Red Gobbo appears in Tacticus in time for Grotmas. With an average rating of 4.5 in the app stores, Tacticus is the go-to game for top-quality tactical gaming. Please remember to download Warhammer 40k Tacticus from the link in the description.
Bram followed in his father's footsteps and entered the Irish civil service. He had begun part-time work there in 1866, a development which explains why he took the unusually long time of 6 years to complete his studies for his Bachelor of Arts at Trinity. After moving through several other positions, Stoker eventually settled on a job in the courts section of the civil service, acting as an inspector. This work took him around the country inspecting the courts in the counties of Ireland and their operations before filing reports back to Dublin. It was formative insofar as this brought Stoker into contact with rural life and settings to a much greater extent than his early life in the capital had. A great proportion of his published works would later be set in rural areas, and some in parts of Ireland that he visited in the course of his work duties in the 1870s, notably his novel The Snake's Pass. In 1879, he also published a book on his experiences working in the civil service, entitled The Duties of Clerks of Petty Sessions in Ireland. Some scholars of Dracula have suggested that the methodical processes which Stoker outlined in this book would later influence the methods which are employed by Van Helsing and his allies to defeat Count Dracula in Stoker's most famous book. That said, with a title like The Duties of Clerks of Petty Sessions in Ireland, it was not an instant bestseller, though, ironically, because it remained a standard textbook on the subject for Irish law court officials for decades to come, it remained widely read into the 20th century. During these years, Bram was developing ambitions to become a writer of a different kind. He became a theatre critic with the Dublin Evening Mail, and through this connection, he became acquainted with Lady Jane Wilde. Wilde was an exceptional figure, a political and social writer who was one of the guiding lights of the Irish literary revival in Dublin in its early days. She had reputedly learned to read 10 different languages before she was 18 years old, and subsequently became a poet and a major influence on the Irish nationalist movement and numerous social issues in Ireland, much like Stoker's mother had been. Through this connection, Stoker's immersion in the Dublin literary world of the 1870s expanded, and Wilde also encouraged him in his writing. He returned the favour, sponsoring her son Oscar's application for membership of the University Philosophical Society at Trinity College when he began studying there in 1871. Stoker began writing short stories during this period, some of which showed an interest in folklore and elements of esoteric history. He also had other cultural interests. An amateur painter and drawer, he was a founding member of the Dublin Sketching Club. In 1875, at 28 years of age, Stoker published his first full novel. This appeared in episodes or segments in the Shamrock, a Dublin literary publication that was published weekly. This was entirely common for the time. Up until the 1960s and 1970s, it was still very normal for novels to appear in serialized form in magazines and periodical publications or journals. This was the standard method of publication in the 19th century, and even literary giants of Victorian Britain like Charles Dickens always published their books in this method before they were later produced in single volumes. In an age before cheap paperbacks, when full hardbound books were comparatively expensive to buy, this format allowed the reading classes to sample sections of books. If they sufficiently liked them, they could later purchase a full hardbound edition of the book. Virtually all of Stoker's novels will be published in this manner. The Primrose Path set the tone for much of his literary career. It involved a struggle between good and evil in the main character Jerry O'Sullivan, a carpenter who ends up descending into alcoholism as his professional aspirations are foiled after moving to London with his wife Katie. He subsequently ends up suspecting her of being unfaithful to him and murders her. With its struggle between good and evil and themes of violence, it foreshadowed the themes of his later career, though there is only a very limited sense of horror and the supernatural of the kind that would appear so frequently in his later work. Stoker's time writing as an occasional theatre critic for the Dublin Evening Mail during these years was important in more ways than one. The paper was co-owned by one Sheridan Le Fanu, a veteran Irish writer of horror and ghost stories. Le Fanu is not well known today, but in his own time and for decades afterwards he was widely credited with having popularized ghost stories amongst the Victorian reading classes. He was a considerable influence on the direction of Stoker's writing style and the subjects he explored, particularly the Gothic horror novel Carmilla, which he published in 1872, shortly before his own death. This features a lesbian vampire named Carmilla, who is revealed to be Countess Karnstein as the book progresses. However, Like Stoker's Dracula, published a quarter of a century after Carmilla, the Countess is not the narrator. Instead, the protagonist is a young woman named Laura, while the book is presented in an unorthodox manner as a series of case notes compiled by a Dr. Hesselius, much as Dracula would be produced as an epistolary novel consisting of letters recounting the events surrounding Count Dracula. Anyone looking to determine what the major influences on Stoker in his composition of Dracula might have been need look no further than Le Fanu's Carmilla. Le Fanu was not the only influence on Stoker in this respect. The 19th century, more broadly, had seen the first major emergence of the genre of Gothic horror and Gothic fiction. A landmark early work in the field was Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, a work published in 1764 and set in a medieval haunted castle, one featuring medieval Gothic architecture, a building style from which the genre derives its name. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein followed half a century later in 1818, a famous horror story which combined Gothic fiction with an excoriating commentary on industrialization and the ways in which Europeans of her time were attempting to gain dominance over nature through science. In the middle of the century, the American short story writer and novelist Edgar Allan Poe composed some of the greatest works of Gothic fiction ever written. His were less inclined towards the supernatural than were those of Shelley and many other predecessors, but the sense of dread and foreboding that hangs over Poe's writings would certainly influence Stoker's writing years later when he came to compose his own most famous work, Dracula. Finally, though less well known today and not really classifiable as a piece of Gothic fiction, Stoker was also influenced by Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White, a mystery novel published in 1860. Stoker's friendship with Lady Jane Wilde would become complicated in the mid-1870s by a love rivalry between Stoker, Wilde's son Oscar, and one Florence Balcombe. Florence was the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel James Balcombe, a British Army officer. The family had a home at Merino Crescent in Clontarf, the same neighbourhood where the Stokers had lived, and so Bram and Florence would have known each other to some extent in the 1860s, though Abraham was considerably older than her. They met again in the mid-1870s, by which time Oscar Wilde was courting Florence, a noted beauty in Dublin at that time. She later rejected Wilde and accepted a proposal of marriage from Stoker, marrying him in 1878 when she was 20 and he was 30. The marriage would only result in one child, Noel, born in 1879. It led to a temporary split between Stoker and the Wildes, although this was as much owing to the Wilde family moving shortly thereafter to London, where they eked out an existence for several years, writing for various publications, Lady Wilde's husband having died in 1876, leaving them saddled with a surprising amount of debt. Stoker would later renew his acquaintance with Oscar in London, and the two evidently resumed their friendship despite the earlier rift, with Bram visiting Wilde on the continent in the late 1890s after his social fall in London had seen him serving a prison sentence between 1895 and 1897, and his voluntary exile on the continent immediately afterwards. Stoker would soon be on the way to London to establish himself there too. In 1878, based on multiple factors such as his many years of writing as a theatre critic and his connections within the Dublin literary scene and to the London Irish like the Wildes, Stoker was approached by Henry Irving with an offer to take up a position in the capital of the British Empire. Irving was one of the most acclaimed actors of his day, so much so that in 1895 he would become the first actor to be awarded a knighthood. This exceptional case was probably because, in addition to being an esteemed thespian, Irving was also a theatre manager. Beginning in the early 1870s, Irving had begun appearing in productions at the Lyceum Theatre in London, a venue that had opened all the way back in 1765 in the West End and which had served as the English Opera House for a time. For most of that era, the Lyceum was managed by Hezekiah Linthicum Bateman, but Bateman died in 1875, leaving Irving tasked with the responsibility of both starring in plays there and managing the theatre. He had no desire or time to perform both roles entirely, and so he eventually headhunted Stoker in 1878 to come to London and manage the Lyceum and its actors. The Dublin man duly agreed. Thus did he set off with Florence to the English capital. He would serve as business manager of the Lyceum for the next 20 years. Irving's mannerisms would subsequently become a partial inspiration for the character of Count Dracula. In London, Stoker became ensconced in literary circles which included some of the most prominent writers and artists of the Victorian age. Such was the centrality of the Lyceum to the culture of the capital in the Victorian era. Irving and his regular leading lady, Ellen Terry, were considered the finest leads of the London stage in the 1880s and 1890s. Those whom Stoker conversed and socialized with at the Lyceum and other venues included the romantic poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, then in the twilight of his life, and the great Irish poet and future Nobel Prize winner W.B. Yeats, then in very much the prime of his life, playwrights like George Bernard Shaw and George Moore, and other writers like Jerome K. Jerome and Anthony Hope. Perhaps the individual who Stoker knew during these years, whose work most closely paralleled Stoker's in terms of the centrality of travel and mystery to it, was Arthur Conan Doyle. The two became friends after one of Doyle's works, The Story of Waterloo, was staged at the Lyceum in 1895. Beyond these writers, Stoker also developed friendships with some of the most famous explorers of the day, such as David Livingstone and the revered American painter James McNeill Whistler, who spent much of his later life living in London. There is a common theme to many of his acquaintances. They were often not Englishmen, but travellers who had found their way to London after much wandering, a notable thing given how central travel and foreign lands would be to Stoker's many novels. Stoker had a great many responsibilities during these years, not least managing the Lyceum, as well as completing legal studies which saw him qualify as a barrister in 1890, although he never practised. He also joined the Irish Literary Society in London. Despite his commitments, he found time to write prolifically, albeit with mixed results. In 1881, he published a book of fairy tales entitled Under the Sunset. while a string of short stories appeared in different magazines and periodicals in the years that followed. These were not terribly well received at the time. However, in the second half of the 20th century, they were re-evaluated in light of the boom in fantasy and science fiction in the 1940s, 1950s and 1960s as early examples of the fantasy genre, overlaid with elements of folklore and medieval history. They were the major output from Stoker for the 1880s. His legal studies led to the driest period in terms of his written output of his time in London in the late 1880s. In 1890, Stoker published a novel which is viewed as a significant precursor to the composition of his most famous work, Dracula. The Snake's Pass centred on the legend of St. Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland, who had allegedly brought Christianity to the country back in the 5th century AD. Though it was not set for the most part in the early medieval period, the early stages of the book do feature St. Patrick banishing the snakes from Ireland. The king of snakes, however, survives and hides in a lake in the west of the country for many centuries. The novel then jumps forward in time to the 19th century. The main character is a man named Arthur Seven, an Englishman who is travelling through the west of Ireland and trying to increase his knowledge of the island's history and lore. After stopping for a time at one particular village, hijinks ensue involving Seven falling in love with a young woman there, one whose father has lost much of his wealth to a local moneylender. The plot then begins to revolve around the lost treasure of the King of Snakes in the shifting bog in the locality. The largest influence of the text on Dracula concerns the introduction of the concept of imperial fiction. As Seven subsequently returns to England and the narrative is taking part in various parts of the British Empire in much the same way as Dracula would later play out in various parts of the Balkans and then back in England. As he was finishing The Snake's Pass, Stoker had been asked to contribute to an experiment in collaborative Victorian writing. The project was a book entitled The Fate of Fenella. The idea was that 24 different authors would each contribute a chapter to the book, with each chapter being published every month throughout 1891 and 1892 in the pages of The Gentlewoman, a popular magazine of the time. Each author would simply take over from where the previous author had left off the previous month, with only a loose structure for the novel developed beforehand. The even-numbered chapters were composed by men, and the odd-numbered chapters by women, with each developing the story of the protagonist Fenella in their own particular way. The novel was reasonably well received, though its primary interest lay in its experimental format and approach. Stoker authored Chapter 10. Other contributors included leading literary luminaries of the day such as Arthur Conan Doyle, Helen Mathers, and Frances Eleanor Trollope. The complete novel was subsequently published as a single-volume novel in 1892. Another work which Stoker produced during these years was Gibbet Hill. The short story's place as a Bram Stoker work was completely forgotten about for 134 years, until it was recently rediscovered. In the autumn of 2024, details emerged that a reader in Ireland had come across it in the 1890 Christmas supplement of the Daily Express, Dublin. This was listed as being a work of Stoker's. This does not correspond with any previously acknowledged Stoker work, and further investigation revealed that this was a work of his that had been so obscure at the time that Stoker scholars were unaware of its existence. Gibbet Hill is another horror story, one set in and named for Gibbet Hill in Surrey in southern England. There, the main character meets a group of 3 children at the bottom of the hill below a site where a memorial had been erected in honour of a sailor who was murdered in the region. The man tells the children that the grave of the murderer is further up along the hill, and they head towards it. At the summit, the man becomes distracted looking out over the view, during which time the children suddenly have a sinister turn of behaviour and murder the protagonist. A large snake, which the children are able to communicate with, then appears, and the story ends with the snake crawling through the chest of the dead man. Gibbet Hill continued Bram Stoker's fascination with snakes, exhibited in many of his works, and continued to develop his work in the fields of horror and the macabre. It's highly unusual that a work by a famed author like Bram Stoker could have been overlooked for 134 years, ever since it was first published. Around 1895, Stoker began working on a new book, one which would become his most celebrated novel, Dracula. As we have seen, there were many influences on Stoker that had moved him in the direction of writing Gothic horror over the past quarter of a century, notably his relationship with Sheridan Le Fanu. Another, more immediate influence was possibly the travel writer Armin Vambery. Vambery was an ethnic Hungarian who had been born in the Slovakia region of the Austrian Empire. In the 1860s, he had travelled extensively throughout the Ottoman Empire and Central Asia, becoming a noted expert on Turkish history and culture in the process. His adventures brought him regularly to London, where it has recently been revealed he was employed as a foreign agent by the British government in The Great Game, the diplomatic rivalry and espionage which was carried out between Russia and Britain across the 19th century for influence in Central Asia. Stoker became acquainted with Vambery during one of his stints in London in the 1890s, and it has been conjectured by more than one scholar of Dracula that he related tales to him about macabre Balkan counts living in the Transylvania region of what is now Romania, but which in centuries gone by was a contested region between ethnic Hungarians, like Vambery, and ethnic Romanians. Vambery's influence may have been substantial in providing the geographical context for a book which Stoker worked on through 1895 and 1896, and eventually published in May 1897. Dracula is a book written in an epistolary format and is considered one of the greatest works of English literature to have employed such an approach. The term derives from the Latin term epistula, meaning a letter. As such, the narrative of Dracula is primarily related as a series of letters written by the main characters after the events have already happened. Stoker certainly did not invent the form, and there was a major precedent for using it in writing a Gothic horror novel. While Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a frame story where a narrative exists within another framing narrative, it is also an epistolary novel where different narratives are related by Victor Frankenstein, the creature he creates, and Captain Walton. This method of multiple narrators was also favoured by Wilkie Collins in his novel The Woman in White, which we have seen was an influence too on Stoker. Other more modern forms of the epistolary novel include the colour purple. In Stoker's version, the narrative is related through letters, diary entries, and newspaper articles. It starts with chapters that purport to be extracts from the diary of Jonathan Harker, before then introducing various other narrators, such as Mina Murray through her letters, Lucy Westenra, and Dr. John Seward. This format allowed Stoker to flesh out the characters by developing their personalities through how they write. Some are more verbose than others, some are very businesslike in how they write, while others drop in additional details about themselves that digress from the main narrative, but flesh out their characters in much the same way that narrative voiceovers function in film and television today. The story of Dracula is perhaps less well known in its full form than its popularity suggests, in part because there have been so many different versions of the Dracula story told since that it is hard to remember at times what the original Stoker version actually involved. The book begins with Jonathan Harker, a lawyer and arguably the main protagonist of the book, relating his journey to Eastern Europe to Castle Dracula in Transylvania in what is now Romania. He is travelling there to conclude a property deal with Count Dracula, the lord of the castle. The closer he gets to his destination, the more the locals have a look of terror when he mentions Castle Dracula and warn him against going there. Several of them give him Christian crucifixes to ward off evil, and others mention a word which in translation equates to vampire. It should be noted that the concept of vampirism is one that had entered the English lexicon in the middle of the 18th century, and it was always closely connected in the British popular perception with Eastern Europe. Despite the warnings of the peasantry of Transylvania, Harker continues on his journey. When he finally arrives at Castle Dracula, he finds a well-mannered and hospitable lord in Count Dracula, but many other things are amiss, and Harker soon discovers that he is unable to leave the castle, effectively making him a prisoner. Things get worse as Harker is attacked one night by 3 female vampires, only for the Count to intervene. Harker tries unsuccessfully thereafter to escape from the castle. The narrative then shifts to England, where Harker's fiancée, Mina Murray, is writing letters to her close friend, Lucy Westenra, who lives in the seaside town of Whitby. Mina eventually visits Lucy around the time that a strange set of events occur in Whitby. First, a ship arrives into port containing 50 crates full of what appears to simply be soil from Castle Dracula in Transylvania. It will become clear eventually that Dracula has smuggled himself to England in the cargo in a shape-shifted form. Soon afterwards, Lucy begins sleepwalking and bite marks on her neck are discovered. At this juncture, Dr. John Seward, a suitor for Lucy's hand in marriage, calls on a friend of his, Professor Abraham Van Helsing, to come and investigate these strange events and determine what might be wrong with Lucy. When he arrives, Van Helsing orders garlic to be hung around Lucy's chamber, and this temporarily leads to an improvement in her condition, although Later her mother, unaware of what Van Helsing is attempting, removes the garlic owing to the smell. Lucy's condition deteriorates again afterwards, and despite the efforts of Seward and Van Helsing, a wolf breaks into Lucy's family home one night, attacking her and causing her mother to have a heart attack. Van Helsing states that Lucy has been transformed into a vampire, and so they must destroy her so that her soul can rest. This they duly do. Meanwhile, Harker has emerged in Budapest after his time at Castle Dracula, confused by his experiences and how he ended up in the Hungarian city. There, he is soon joined by Mina, who makes the trip to visit him. They return to England, where they are informed of everything that has happened with Lucy by Van Helsing, Seward, and several others who are working with them. On Van Helsing's advice, they have determined that they must now destroy Count Dracula once and for all. At this juncture, it is explained that Mina collects together the letters and diary entries for Van Helsing, which constitute the narrative of the book. His investigations proceed well, but a nefarious character called Renfield, who has become a stooge of the Count, acts in a way which allows Dracula access to Mina, who he has decided will be his next victim. However, before he can fully realize his plans, the men track down the 50 crates of soil which arrived from Castle Dracula. They sterilize the crates, causing Dracula to flee back to Transylvania. They then pursue him to the Balkans. At Castle Dracula, the female vampires who attacked Harker early on in the novel are destroyed, while the entryways to the castle are sealed and protected with religious objects. This allows them to tighten the noose, and eventually the party catch Dracula and stab him to death. With this, the threat from the Count is resolved, and the book ends, ostensibly with a happy ending for Harker and Mina. The final passage is a note written by Mina 7 years after the events of the book, in which they are happily married with a son named Quincy, in honor of one of the hunting party that was killed in the Balkans. Ever since Dracula first appeared in print, there have been efforts to identify a historical character that Stoker was basing Count Dracula on. Unsurprisingly, given his name and the setting of much of the book in Transylvania, some have concluded that Stoker had the 15th century voivode, or Prince of Wallachia, a region near Transylvania in Romania, Vlad Dracula or Vlad III in mind. This reputedly incredibly violent ruler of Wallachia earned the sobriquet Vlad the Impaler as a result of his penchant for impaling his enemies on wooden stakes, though to what extent he was exceptional in his violence or if his misdeeds were exaggerated is open to interpretation. Vlad had been written about in the Anglophone world in the 1880s in a book about Transylvanian superstitions and folklore written by Emily Gerard. Yet, scholars of Dracula have cast doubt on the idea that Stoker really knew much about Vlad the Impaler and had him in mind as an inspiration for the character of the Count. In all likelihood, he simply knew of the name Dracul as being associated with the dynasty that ruled a large part of Romania in late medieval times, and applied a slight variant of it, Dracula, to his titular character as a result. More broadly, The actual character was based on a collection of characters from the Balkans in centuries gone by, with Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian noblewoman who, in the early 17th century, allegedly had hundreds of victims lured to her country estate before killing them, being another potential inspiration. When it was first published at the end of the 19th century, Dracula was hailed as a fairly straightforward Gothic horror and mystery story. It is only really since the middle of the 20th century that the book's more subtle themes and deeper messages have been investigated. Numerous different theories have emerged. Perhaps the most obvious is what it says about British attitudes towards the Balkans and people from the more easterly parts of Europe during a period of approximately half a century, when places like Transylvania were constantly in the newspapers owing to the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, the Turks having become the so-called sick man of Europe. This was combined with the 19th century revival of interest in folklore and tales of horror, perhaps best exemplified on the continent in the works of the Grimm brothers. These parts of Europe, places like Romania, Hungary and Bulgaria, had also begun to produce the first major westward waves of migration from the Balkans seen in modern European history. For instance, in the 17th, 18th and for much of the 19th centuries, migration to the New World, Western Europe or other European colonies in India and Africa had been the virtual preserve of groups like the English, Scots, Irish, French, Dutch, Germans, Spanish, Portuguese and Italians from Western and Central Europe. Then, beginning after the revolutions which swept the continent in 1848, waves of new migration from regions like Hungary, Romania, Poland and Ukraine to the Americas, or even to places like Britain, began. Stoker's book possibly represented both a curiosity concerning places like Transylvania in Britain and also contemporary anxieties about the westward movement of people from these lands in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, something captured by both the strangeness of Count Dracula and Transylvania in the book and his arrival to England in the course of it. Other theories hold that the book is a veiled commentary on the political state of Stoker's native Ireland at the end of the Victorian Age. Ireland had constantly been at the forefront of the British political news at the time. This was because the Irish Parliamentary Party, which was led by Charles Stewart Parnell for many years, and which wanted Home Rule for Ireland by re-establishing a devolved parliament in Dublin, had become the virtual kingmaker in several British parliaments, as William Gladstone's Liberals were often reliant on Irish support to have a majority at the Westminster Parliament. Stoker's book has shadowy references to Ireland, and some scholars of Dracula have argued Transylvania is basically an analogy for Ireland. Consider that Lucy Westenra's unusual surname is actually taken from the family of a leading group of British colonials in County Monaghan in Ireland, a region which Stoker visited as part of his duties as an officer of the Irish courts back in the 1870s, before he relocated to London. Similarly, the character of Count Dracula himself could be seen as paralleling the story of the legendary Irish chieftain Ardach, who was said to have terrorized his subjects in ancient times, and whose story was outlined in the Irish folklorist Patrick Joyce's The Origin and History of Irish Names of Places in 1870. Finally, Dracula can also be read as a late Victorian commentary on disease. This was an era of incredible medical breakthroughs, ones which established systems of medicine and pharmacology that we all benefit from today. Yet, innovations always arouse suspicions as well, on top of which Europe had been dealing with the so-called Blue Death, waves of cholera that ravaged large cities like London between the 1830s and 1890s. All of this created anxiety around disease and bloodletting, which Dracula's blood-sucking and the fate of Lucy were reflective of. This extended to Stoker's own personal health. He suffered from syphilis, a bacterial infection which is generally transmitted sexually. His own marriage appears to have been a frigid affair, reflected perhaps in the fact that he and Florence did not have another child after their first, Noel, was born in 1879. Given this, and his close friendship with Wilde and other individuals who were known to be gay or bisexual at the time, there has been speculation that his syphilis might have been contracted through homosexual affairs, though the evidence remains inconclusive on that front. In any event, Stoker was sick, and given the themes of contamination by blood-sucking which feature so prominently in Dracula, many analysts of the book have understandably argued that it reflects his own anxieties about his syphilitic condition, having possibly only become aware of his illness in 1895 or 1896, when he was writing Dracula. Ultimately, there are many veiled themes in the book below the surface level of a Gothic horror and mystery novel. Something completely unexpected and unprecedented happened when Dracula was published in 1897. It did well. Reviewers were complimentary about the book, praising the literary style and the excellent use of the epistolary form, as well as the sense of horror and foreboding that lies over the reader as the book develops. It was assessed by some as the best rendition of the vampire myth or story ever written, one which plugged into contemporary interest in the Balkans and Gothic horror quite well. An especially glowing appraisal described Stoker as the Edgar Allan Poe of the 1890s, while there were also inevitable allusions to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White, amongst more erudite reviewers. That said, it wasn't all positive. It never is, and tales of subsequent literary successes being blocked from publication or ridiculed early on are a dime a dozen. In the case of Dracula, many reviewers claimed that the horror was too intense and the scenes too scary. One opined that the plot device, which had Count Dracula being allergic to garlic, was laughable. Yet, overall, the critical response was positive. Dracula sold well, and when Stoker's work at the Lyceum Theatre came to an end the following year, he was able to employ the proceeds from his writing career and his savings to work henceforth largely as a full-time writer, though it should be noted that it was not a blockbuster seller either in Stoker's own day. Dracula would really only become a huge seller in the 1920s, following the appearance of the first film based on the book, the 1922 silent film Nosferatu. In 1903, hoping to benefit from another successful horror story, Stoker published The Jewel of 7 Stars. The book centres on the character of Malcolm Ross, a barrister who is called early on in the book to the home of an Egyptologist named Abel Trelawney. There, Abel has been left incapacitated by a series of strange events. It is revealed that he is persistently waking up in the middle of the night only to be found by others in the house covered in blood. Ross has been called in to investigate. This work leads him to Eugene Corbeck, another Egyptologist that Trelawney worked with years earlier investigating the tomb of Queen Terra in Egypt. He reveals that they were placed under trance while inside a tomb by a mummy. As the plot develops, it is revealed that Queen Terra's astral body is attempting to retrieve the Jewel of 7 Stars, which Trelawney retrieved years earlier from her tomb using a mummified cat. Ross subsequently becomes convinced that Margaret Trelawney, Abel's daughter, whom Malcolm has been courting, has been infiltrated by the astral spirit of Queen Terra. He organizes a trap to try and draw her out into the open, but it goes horribly wrong, resulting in the death of several of the main characters, Margaret included. The book was moderately successful on publication. Clearly, though, the ending might have been presented differently to meet the expectations of readers at the time, and when the book was reissued in 1912, it was done so with an alternative ending in which the trap is foiled, everyone survives, and Ross marries Margaret sometime later. Perhaps it was his failure to meet with similar success to that he found with Dracula in subsequent Gothic and Imperial horror books like The Jewel of 7 Stars, which led Stoker to experiment with other genres and forms in the mid to late 1900s. One example is Lady Athleen, a book published in 1908. This was a romance novel. It centered on Joy Ogilvy, the daughter of a Kentucky-based army officer. After reading the story of a dashing young Irish nobleman called Lord Athleen, she begins to spin an elaborate story in Kentucky that she had married this Lord Athleen. Word of this eventually reaches the real Lord Athleen, who has just been in a prisoner of war camp in South Africa during the Second Boer War. Freed from captivity, he subsequently makes his way to the United States and to Kentucky, where, after tracking Joy down, he and she do genuinely begin to fall in love. The conflict then centers on the objections of Joy's father to her actually becoming Lady Athleen. The Lady of the Shroud followed in 1909, written once again in an epistolary format using letters and diary extracts to tell the story, and involving vampirism, castles, and a mysterious Balkan noble. The novel was derivative of Stoker's own work in Dracula and has been interpreted as a lackluster attempt to repeat his past success with a very similar story. In 1911, Stoker published his last and possibly one of his strangest books. The Lair of the White Worm was another horror novel. It features an Australian protagonist by the name of Adam Salton, who travels to England to visit his great-uncle Richard, who wishes to make Adam his heir. Things take a sinister turn as Adam becomes more acquainted with events on neighbouring estates owned by Edgar Caswell and Arabella March. The titular White Worm is a giant snake-like creature that emerges from a pit deep under March's house and which is terrorizing the country. Amongst other rather outlandish plot devices, the novel features an African servant obsessed with torture, hypnotism, a Burmese cousin, a mongoose which is brought in to hunt snakes on one of the estates, and an attempt to kill the white worm using dynamite. Pamela Coleman Smith, a collaborator with Arthur Edward Waite right around this time in producing one of the most iconic tarot card decks ever produced, worked on the colour illustrations which accompanied The Lair of the White Worm. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the over-the-top narrative, it was not well received. In the years that followed, many prominent writers categorized it as one of the worst horror novels ever written. It was made into a 1988 supernatural comedy film with early roles for Hugh Grant and Peter Capaldi. The very fact that it was readapted as a comedy points towards how slapstick and underdeveloped the novel was. The peculiar writing style and plot of The Lair of the White Worm has given rise to speculation that Stoker, who was in his mid-60s when the book was published, was not of entirely sound mind when he wrote it. Over time, syphilis leads to major psychological issues such as depression, mania, delirium, dementia, and overall cognitive decline, especially so in extreme cases. For instance, the famous Chicago gangster Al Capone contracted syphilis early in life. Before his 40th year, his cognitive decline had reduced him to the mental state of a child, so much so that he was given early release from prison. Stoker's case was nowhere near as drastic, though it may have begun to erode his writing abilities in his last years. Syphilis can also lead to strokes, and it was this which caused Stoker's swift decline and death not long after the publication of The Lair of the White Worm, though speculation in the decades that followed by some literary scholars that he was clinically insane by then are misjudged. He suffered several strokes around this time, one of which took his life in London on the 20th of April 1912. He had been suffering from locomotor ataxia caused by kidney failure associated with his syphilis at the time, and this was the underlying cause of his death, in addition to the strokes, at the age of 64. His remains were cremated and were stored in an urn at Golders Green Crematorium in London. The Lair of the White Worm might have established Bram Stoker's limitations as a writer, something further attested to by the simple fact that despite producing over a dozen novels and a great volume of short stories, he is remembered for one book alone today. That same book had an enormous impact on the popular culture of the 20th century. Almost anyone who hears the name Dracula today will associate the word with a vampire from Transylvania, whether they have read Stoker's novel or not. His image is ubiquitous in popular culture, with his mannerisms, black long coat, and fanged teeth also well known of. This is largely because the Dracula story was reproduced in so many guises from the late 1890s onwards. Immediately after it was first published, the Lyceum Theatre ran a stage production of the novel, the first of a great many different stage productions that have appeared over the century and a quarter since. Stage productions in New York and Los Angeles in the 1920s were some of the most commercially successful plays of the 20th century. Musicals and operatic variants have also been produced. Perhaps the most surprising additions to the canon have been ballets of Dracula that have abounded since the first successful version was performed in the late 1990s. The character has also been central to an enormous number of books, short stories, and other printed works over the last century and a quarter, while video games and radio programs, including one famously produced by Orson Welles late in his life, have also appeared. Perhaps the most iconic adaptations of Dracula are those which have appeared on screen. As early as the 1920s, when silent films were still in vogue and only gradually being replaced by the talkies, pictures were released that adapted Stoker's novel. As well as the aforementioned Nosferatu in 1931, a Universal Studios version of Dracula was one of the most successful movies of the era and spawned numerous follow-ups, such as Son of Dracula. One of the most critically well-received film versions was Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire, released in 1979, though loosely based on Stoker's novel. In modern recent times, the great American director Francis Ford Coppola released a film version of the Dracula story in 1992, starring Gary Oldman as the Count, while spin-offs of the character Van Helsing have also appeared. There is disagreement as to what constitutes a Dracula film, as so many are loose adaptations. Most agree that there have been around 80 film versions at least, as well as a great many television series. It is one of the most iconic stories in Western cinema and television. Finally, in recent times, Bram's great-grandnephew Dacre Stoker has produced both an authorized sequel and prequel to Dracula, Dracula the Undead, published in 2009, and Dracula, published in 2018, both of which at least partly draw on Bram's notes and journals, though these do not represent completed versions of books he had planned. Abraham Bram Stoker is a very well-known modern writer. Despite how many people have heard of him, very few people know much at all about Bram Stoker's life. He is remembered today almost exclusively for one book, despite authoring over a dozen novels and a huge number of short stories over a writing career of 4 decades. Some of these other outpourings were moderately well received in their day, though others, such as his last work, The Lair of the White Worm, are as infamous for how ludicrous their plots are as anything else. Ultimately, Stoker's legacy hinges entirely on Dracula, first published in 1897. That in itself is rather strange. The allegorical meanings which Stoker wished to suffuse it with, whether they concerned Irish politics, views on obscure ethnic groups from the Balkans and late 19th century Europe, or his own anxieties about his syphilis, remain confused for the most part. Instead, the book gained popularity because of its narrative, ominous theme, and story alone, not the wider meaning Stoker wished to convey. It was this which made Dracula so popular in its own time and ever since. It will forever be what Stoker is remembered for. What do you think of Bram Stoker? Was he an example of a writer with one great book in him? Or is it possible that Dracula too is an overrated work, one with vague themes that ultimately benefited from having an unclear meaning? Please, Let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
With an average rating of 4.5 in the App Stores, Tacticus is the go-to game for top-quality tactical gaming. Please remember to download Warhammer 40k Tacticus from the link in the description.